The needle went in cleanly, and Nora did not look away. She had threaded it with silk from her mending basket, the good silk, the kind she kept for hems that could not afford to fray, and she had poured spirits over the needle's curve until the metal gleamed wet in the firelight. Her hands were steady. They had been steady since Thomas had appeared at her cottage door, white as linen, stammering about the Duke and the horse and the fence rail that had splintered through the animal's foreleg and sent its rider into the stones beside the east pasture wall. Piers Colquhoun, Duke of Aldermere, lay on her kitchen table with his coat cut open from wrist to shoulder and a gash across his upper arm that had exposed the muscle beneath. He had not screamed when they carried him in. He had not screamed when she cleaned the wound with the spirits either, though his jaw had set so hard she heard his teeth meet. He watched her now with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to trust or to resist, and finding that circumstance had removed the luxury of choice. "Hold your arm against the table," Nora said, not a request. She pressed the heel of her hand against the skin beside the wound to stretch it taut and brought the needle to the first edge of torn flesh. The Duke inhaled sharply through his nose. His eyes moved from her hands to her face and stayed there. She drew the thread through. One stitch, clean even, the tension precise enough that the edges of the wound met without puckering. The blood welled around the silk, and she blotted it with linen without breaking her rhythm, the way a seamstress blots ink without lifting her pen. The hearth behind her threw long shadows across the table and across the Duke's chest, which rose and fell with the controlled breathing of a man who had decided that control was the only thing left available to him. She had learned this from her husband, not a surgeon, not a physician, but a man who had served as a naval lieutenant for 11 years before a fever took him in a Portsmouth lodging house 3 days before he was meant to come home. Lieutenant Josiah Vane had written to her once about sewing a midshipman's arm shut during a squall when the surgeon was below decks vomiting into a basin. The letter had arrived in November, rain-spotted, the ink smeared at the fold where the paper had been crammed into a coat pocket. He had described the motion with the same detachment he used for everything practical. In through one side, across, up through the other, pull until the flesh meets but not beyond. Tie off each stitch as though it were the last, because at sea you never knew which one it might be. She had never expected to use the knowledge. She had kept the letter. It was in the drawer of her writing desk, 12 feet from where the Duke now lay, folded into quarters and softened along the creases from handling. The second stitch went in. Nora wiped the blood that welled around the thread with a strip of linen she had torn from an old chemise, and she did not pause between the wiping and the next puncture. There was no performance in her efficiency, no demonstration of bravery meant to be admired. She was simply doing what needed doing in the order it needed to be done, and the fact that the man on her table held a dukedom and sat in the House of Lords and owned the land her cottage stood upon did not alter the requirements of a wound. Piers had stopped watching her hands entirely. He watched only her face. She knew this because she could feel the quality of his attention change, the way a room changes when someone stops looking at the thing before them and begins instead to see the person holding it. She did not meet his eyes. Far, there was no need. The wound was the task, and the task was not yet finished, and everything else, his title, his presence in her kitchen, the strangeness of a duke bleeding on a table where she usually ate bread and butter alone, everything else could wait until the last stitch was tied and the linen wrapped and the needle returned to its case. The third stitch. The fourth. His breathing had steadied now, and she noticed that he had stopped gripping the edge of the table with his free hand. Whether this was trust or exhaustion she could not tell, and she did not ask. She had spoken exactly 3 sentences since Thomas had dragged him through her door. "Hold your arm against the table. Do not move. This will sting." And she saw no reason to add a fourth until the work was done. She was not, by nature, a quiet woman. Josiah had called her forthright, which was the word generous husbands used for wives who said precisely what they meant at the moment they meant it. But she had learned, in the 2 years since his death, that silence had its own kind of utility. It kept the vicar's wife from visiting too often. It kept the tenants from assuming her widowhood was an invitation to pity. And it kept the Duke of Aldermere, on the rare occasions he rode past her cottage, from ever once stopping to inquire how she fared, which suited her well enough, because she had no interest in performing gratitude for a man who owned her roof, but had never troubled himself to learn her name. He knew it now. Tomas had said it while laying him on the table. "Mrs. Vane will help you, Your Grace." She knows what she is about. Whether she knew what she was about was a matter of some debate. She knew how to keep a kitchen garden, how to stretch a naval widow's pension across 12 months when it was meant for 10, how to mend a fence and darn a stocking, and read French well enough to manage Montaigne, but not Molière. She knew how to be alone in a cottage at the edge of an estate where no one came unless they wanted something. And she knew, apparently, how to sew a duke's arm shut while he watched her face with an expression she chose not to examine too closely. The fifth stitch. She paused to thread more silk through the needle's eye and noticed, without acknowledging it, that his breathing had taken on the slower rhythm of a man who was no longer bracing for pain. She did not take this as a compliment. "You have done this before," Piers said. His voice was lower than she expected, roughened by pain or by the particular effort of speaking while someone was stitching muscle and skin together on one's arm. "I have not." A beat of silence. She felt his gaze sharpen. "My husband described the method in a letter," she said, because the truth was simpler than any alternative, and she had no energy for alternatives. He was a naval officer. He sewed a man's arm shut during a storm. He wrote well enough that I remembered the instructions. She did not add that she had read the letter perhaps 40 times in the 2 years since Josiah's death, not for the medical instructions, for the handwriting, for the way he formed his capital letters, the tall, confident J, the sweeping V of his surname, which was also now hers and would remain so, because she had no intention of giving it up for anyone. The sixth stitch. Piers was silent for a long moment. She could feel him not asking the question that pressed against the silence. What had happened to the husband, where he was now? Why a naval officer's wife lived alone in a dour cottage at the edge of a duke's estate? She did not volunteer the answers. "The surgeon has been sent for," Nora said instead, tying off the stitch. "Mr. Shand from the village. He will arrive within the hour. I expect he will have opinions about my work." "Your work," Piers said slowly, "is the reason I am not currently bleeding onto your kitchen floor." "Yes," Nora said. "It is also the reason there are bloodstains on my good tablecloth, which I expect will not come out regardless of how long I soak it." She said this without rancor, without charm, without the faintest trace of flirtation. It was a fact. The tablecloth was ruined. The Duke was not. On balance, this was the correct outcome, but the tablecloth had been a wedding gift from Josiah's mother, and she would miss it. The seventh stitch. She felt the rhythm of the work settle into her hands the way bread kneading did, or the way digging in the garden did on the mornings when the earth was soft after rain, a task that belonged to the body rather than the mind, leaving the mind free to observe what the body was too occupied to worry about. What she observed was this. The Duke of Aldermere, who had returned from London 3 days ago after the session in the House of Lords had concluded, who had been riding hard across his own lands as though trying to outrun something that was not a horse, had a scar on his right hand that looked like a knife wound and a stillness in his expression that she recognized. Not pain, not shock, patience. The particular patience of a man who had been hurt before and understood that the only useful response was to hold still and let the person with the needle finish. She wondered briefly where he had learned that. The eighth stitch. His eyes had not left her face. She realized with a clarity that arrived without invitation that he was not watching her hands because he had already decided to trust them. He was watching her face because he could not understand what he saw there. She knew what he saw. Composure. Not the manufactured kind, not the rigid mask of a woman performing calm, but the genuine article. The composure of a woman who had received a letter informing her that her husband had died of a fever in a Portsmouth lodging house and had read it twice, folded it neatly, placed it on the mantelpiece, and then gone outside to dig the potatoes because the potatoes would not dig themselves. She was not brave. She had never claimed to be brave. She simply did not see the utility of flinching when flinching would not alter the circumstance, and this unadorned practicality, this absolute absence of performance, was the thing the Duke of Aldermere was seeing for the first time in his life, and it was the thing he could not forget. The ninth stitch, the last. She tied it off with the same careful tension as the first, cut the thread with the kitchen scissors, and pressed a folded linen strip against the closed wound. Her hands were steady as she wrapped the linen around his arm, once, twice, tucking the end under itself the way Josiah had described in another letter, the one about the midshipman's arm 3 weeks after the storm, healed cleanly with barely a scar. There, Nora said. She stepped back from the table and wiped her hands on her apron. There was blood on the apron. There was blood on her sleeve and on the edge of the basin and on the table where his arm had lain. The cottage smelled of spirits and tallow and the faint copper edge of blood, and the candles on the mantelpiece had burned down 1/4 of an inch since Thomas had first knocked on her door. Piers sat up slowly. He looked at his arm, at the neat row of stitches visible beneath the edge of the linen wrap, and then he looked at her. "You did not flinch," he said. "No, not once. There was no reason to flinch. The wound was not mine." He stared at her for a long moment, the kind of stare that in another man might have been rude, but in him was something else, something closer to recalibration, as though he were adjusting every assumption he had carried about the woman in the dower cottage to account for the fact that she had just sewed his arm shut with mending silk and kitchen scissors and had spoken fewer than 20 words while doing it. Mr. Shand arrived 40 minutes later, rain-damp and apologetic, carrying a leather case that clinked with instruments. He unwrapped the linen, examined the stitches under the light of the candle Nora held for him, and said nothing for a very long time. Then he looked at Nora. "Whoever taught you this," he said, "taught you well." "My husband," Nora said, "by letter." Mr. Shand's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. He looked at the stitches again. Then he looked at the Duke. "Your Grace, you may leave these in for 10 days. I could not have done better myself, and I have the advantage of having done it before." He rewrapped the arm with fresh linen from his case, gave instructions about keeping the wound dry, and left with the particular efficiency of a man who recognized that his services were not, in fact, required. The cottage was quiet after he left. Nora stood at the basin washing the blood from her hands and watching the water turn pink in the candlelight. Piers sat at the edge of the table, her kitchen table, the one where she ate alone, and did not move toward the door. "I should send for the carriage," he said. "Yes. Tomas can fetch it. Tomas went back to the stable 20 minutes ago. He will have told them where you are." Another silence. She dried her hands on a cloth and began folding the unused linen strips, because her hands wanted occupation, and she did not trust them to be still while the Duke of Aldermere sat in her kitchen, watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something she was not yet prepared to name. The carriage came. He left. She cleaned the table, soaked the tablecloth in cold water and salt, and went to bed. She did not think about his expression. She thought about the 9th stitch, whether the tension had been precisely right, whether the knot would hold, whether Josiah would have approved. She thought Josiah would have approved. The Duke returned 3 days later. He said it was to have the wound checked, and Nora, who had never been skilled at pretending, checked it. The stitches were holding cleanly. There was no sign of putrefaction. She told him this in the same voice she used for everything, level, factual, unembellished, and he sat in the chair beside her hearth and did not leave for an hour. He came back the following day, and the day after. By the 5th visit, neither of them mentioned the wound. He sat in the chair beside her hearth, a chair that had been Josiah's, though she did not tell him this, and she continued whatever she had been doing when he arrived, mending a petticoat, turning the pages of a botanical guide she had borrowed from the vicar's lending shelf, writing a letter to Josiah's mother in Devonshire, who still wrote to her quarterly and addressed the letters to my dear daughter, as though death had not severed the connection but merely lengthened the distance. She did not perform hospitality. She offered him tea because she had the kettle on the hearth. She did not lay out cakes or arrange cushions or change into a better dress. Her dress was the same gray wool she wore every day, practical, clean, unremarkable. He drank the tea. He watched her dig potatoes. Once, when she came back inside with dirt on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins, she found him reading Josiah's copy of Montaigne from the shelf beside the hearth, and she said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing either of them had experienced in years. On the 7th visit, he brought a book of his own, a volume of estate records he was reviewing for the quarter. He sat in the chair and read while she worked at the table, and the cottage held them both the way a room holds 2 candles, separately lit but warming the same space. She noticed that he turned pages slowly. She noticed that he glanced up when she moved, not to watch her, but to confirm that she was still there, the way one confirms a hearth fire is still burning without staring at it. On the 9th visit, it rained. He arrived soaked, and did not apologize for dripping on her floor. She handed him a cloth without comment and put the kettle back on the hearth. They sat on either side of the fire, listening to the rain against the windows, and he told her, without preamble, without being asked, about the first Duchess. Her name had been Charlotte. She had died in childbed 7 years ago, and the child with her, and Piers had not spoken her name aloud in any room since the funeral, until this moment, in a cottage that smelled of rosemary and wet wool, to a woman who listened the way she did everything else, completely, without performance, without the flicker of managed sympathy that he had learned to dread from everyone who knew. Nora did not say she was sorry. She said, "What did she look like?" And Piers, who had been braced for pity, found instead that he was describing Charlotte's face to a woman who actually wanted to see it. The freckles, the way she laughed with her whole mouth, the particular shade of red her hair turned in September light, and that the describing did not hurt the way he had expected it to. It hurt the way setting a bone hurts, precisely, necessarily, and with the promise of healing afterward. It was Croft, the steward, who noticed first. He mentioned it to Mrs. Bird, the housekeeper, over the weekly accounts, that His Grace had been riding to the East Cottage every afternoon, that the horse was always tied for at least an hour, that the Duke returned in a different temper than the one he left in. Not better, exactly. Quieter. As though something had been settled that Croft had not been aware was unsettled. Mifeh Bird, who had managed Aldermere Hall for 11 years and had outlasted 2 stewards and 1 duchess, the first duchess, who had died in childbed before Piers was 30, said only that Mrs. Vane was a sensible woman and left the matter there. The sensible woman, meanwhile, was aware of precisely what was happening and had decided not to interfere with it. She understood that the Duke of Aldermere was falling in love with her, and she understood that the mechanism by which this was occurring was not her beauty, which was ordinary, or her wit, which was sharp but unpolished, or her circumstances, which were modest to the point of irrelevance. It was her hands, or rather, it was what her hands had told him about the rest of her, that she was a woman who could be trusted with a wound, with a crisis, with the kind of raw, unvarnished reality that most people in his world spent their entire lives avoiding. She understood this because she was not a fool, and because she had been married to a man who had loved her for the same reason, and because she recognized the look on Piers Colquhoun's face when he watched her. It was the look Josiah had worn the morning she had told him, calmly and without tears, that she understood the risks of a naval career and did not require him to apologize for choosing it. Josiah had looked at her then the way Piers looked at her now, as though he had been searching for something without knowing what it was and had found it in the last place he thought to look. She did not make it easy for him. She did not make it difficult either. She simply continued to be exactly what she was and let him decide whether that was enough. It was 6 weeks before the matter came to a point, and the point was not what either of them expected. Lady Hessop called at Aldermere Hall on a Tuesday in late September, accompanied by her daughter, Miss Louisa Hessop, and a clear ambition to see the daughter installed as the next Duchess. Lady Hessop was handsome, well-connected, and possessed of the particular confidence that came from never having been refused anything significant. She had heard that the Duke was in want of a wife, the ton's favorite euphemism for a man who had been alone long enough that his absence from the marriage market had become conspicuous, and she intended to remedy the situation with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. Piers received them in the drawing-room because manners required it. He offered tea because hospitality demanded it. Miss Louisa Hessop was pretty and well-rehearsed, and she sat on the edge of the settee with the careful posture of a young woman who had been told exactly what to do with her hands and exactly how long to hold a duke's gaze before looking modestly away. She performed these instructions competently. Piers noticed none of them. He was thinking about the way Nora had handed him a cloth when he arrived, soaked at her door. No fuss, no exclamation about the rain, no fluttering concern for his health. Just a cloth and a kettle, and the quiet assumption that he was capable of drying himself. When Lady Hessop, in the course of conversation, mentioned that she had heard the Duke had been injured and that a woman on the estate had attended him, Piers said only that he had been well cared for. "A tenant's widow, I understand," Lady Hessop said, with the precise inflection of a woman who wished to establish that she already knew and did not approve. She adjusted her gloves, an unnecessary gesture, a punctuation mark. I hope she was not forward in her attentions. Miss Louisa looked at her hands. Croft, standing by the sideboard, looked at the wall. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked 3 times before Piers spoke. He set down his teacup with a steadiness that Nora would have recognized. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "sewed my wound shut with silk thread and mending scissors while I watched. I have seen soldiers refuse the same procedure from trained surgeons. She did not flinch. She did not speak except to give instructions. She did not ask for thanks. And she has not mentioned it since." He paused. "I would be grateful, Lady Hessop, if you would not refer to her competence as forwardness." The silence in the drawing room was, Croft later told Mrs. Bird, the loudest he had ever heard. Lady Hessop and her daughter departed before luncheon. They were not invited to stay. The following afternoon, Piers rode to the East Cottage and found Nora in the garden, cutting the last of the autumn herbs. She looked up when she heard the horse and returned to the rosemary without comment. He tied the horse and walked to where she was working, and stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back, watching her cut rosemary with the same steady hands that had sewn his skin together 8 weeks earlier. "I have sent Lady Hessop away," he said. "I heard." "You heard." "Croft told Mrs. Bird. Mrs. Bird told the cook told Thomas. Thomas told me yesterday when he came for eggs." The faintest trace of a smile crossed her face, the first he had seen from her, and it altered everything the way a single candle alters a dark room. Not dramatically, sufficiently. "I was not kind to her," Piers said. "No," Nora agreed, "but you were accurate." She cut another sprig of rosemary and placed it in the basket at her feet. The light was pale gold, the last warmth of September, the kind that made everything look as though it had been painted in honey and was about to cool. "I should like you to come to Aldermere Hall," he said. "I come to Aldermere Hall every Tuesday to return eggs to the kitchen." "I should like you to come in a different capacity." She looked up at him then, directly. The same steady gaze she had fixed on his wound while she stitched it, assessing, calm, free of any anxiety about what she might find. "What capacity?" she asked, though she knew. "My wife." He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. He stood in her herb garden with dirt on his boots and the scar she had given him visible at the edge of his rolled sleeve, and he said it the way she would have wanted it said, plainly, without ornament, as a statement of fact rather than a performance of feeling. Nora looked at him for a long time. She thought about Josiah, not with grief, but with the particular tenderness of a woman who had loved well and been loved well and understood that love was not a thing that ran out. She thought about the cottage and the potatoes and the copy of Montaigne that Piers had been reading, chapter by chapter, every time he visited, leaving a ribbon at his place as though he intended to finish it. She thought about his face on her kitchen table, the way he had stopped watching her hands and started watching her, and how the quality of his attention had felt like the first true thing that had happened to her since the letter from Portsmouth. "I should like that," she said. They were married in the chapel at Aldermere Hall, on a morning in November when the light came through the windows in long, pale columns, and the congregation was small enough that every face was one Nora knew. Mrs. Bird in the second pew with her handkerchief already in her hand, Croft standing stiffly at the back with his arms behind him as though guarding the door, Thomas scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in a borrowed coat that was too large in the shoulders. Mr. Shan sat near the front, and when Nora walked past him, he inclined his head with the quiet respect of a man who knew what her hands were capable of. The vicar read the service. Nora wore a dress of pale gray silk, not white, because she had been married before, and not anything she was not, because she had never seen the point. The silk was good quality, a gift from Piers that she had accepted without protest, because it was practical. She would wear it again, and it would last, and there was no sentimentality in owning a well-made dress. Piers held her hand during the vows with the steadiness of a man who understood what he was choosing, and Nora looked at him with the same expression she had worn while sewing his wound, present, focused, entirely without pretense. She spoke the words clearly. She did not cry. She did not tremble. The vicar, who had married her to Josiah 12 years earlier in a church in Devonshire, would have recognized nothing different in her bearing except this. She was calmer now. Not because she loved less, but because she understood better what love required, and she was no longer afraid of requiring it. Mrs. Bird wept. Croft did not. Thomas dropped the prayer book. The Tun learned of the marriage in the way the Tun learned of everything, through a cascade of letters and whispers that gained embellishment with every retelling. The Duke of Aldermere had married a nobody, a widow, a tenant's wife who kept chickens and grew her own herbs and had dirt under her fingernails more often than not. A woman who had, and here the story always paused for effect, sewn his wound shut with her own hands, without flinching, while he watched. The story was accurate, which was unusual for the ton, and the accuracy was its power. No one could invent a detail more compelling than the truth of it, a woman with steady hands and no need to be seen being brave. Lady Hessop said to anyone who would listen that the Duke had been taken advantage of during a moment of physical weakness. This interpretation failed to gain traction, largely because Mr. Shand, who had examined the stitches, mentioned at a dinner party that the work was finer than anything he had seen from a trained hand, and that the Duke had been in no danger by the time Mrs. Vane had finished. The implication was clear. The Duke had not married her because she had saved him. He had married her because of the manner in which she had done it. The scar healed into a thin white line that followed the curve of his upper arm. In the evenings when they sat in the library at Aldermere Hall, his chair by the fire, hers by the window, she would sometimes see him touch it absently, running his thumb along the ridge of it, as though reminding himself of something he did not want to forget. She never asked what he was remembering. She did not need to. 4 years passed. Aldermere flourished under the particular kind of management that occurs when a duchess treats an estate the way she treats a kitchen garden, with attention, practicality, and no tolerance for waste. Nora worked through Croft, who deferred to her judgment with the relief of a man who had spent years making decisions alone and was grateful to share the weight. The tenants brought their disputes to her because she listened without interruption and answered without evasion, and because she had once walked 2 miles in the rain to help a tenant's wife deliver a calf when the animal was breech and the husband was in the village and there was no one else. She did not flinch during that either. The calf lived. The tenant's wife named it Nora, which the Duchess found more amusing than flattering. Piers returned from London each session with the same expression, the look of a man who had spent weeks in rooms full of rhetoric and performance, and was hungry for someone who said only what she meant. He would find her in the garden or the still room or the kitchen, where she and Mrs. Bird had developed an understanding that was less hierarchy than partnership. The housekeeper managed the hall, the Duchess managed everything else, and neither interfered with the other's domain. He would stand in the doorway watching her for a moment before she noticed him, and in that moment his face would do the thing it had done on her kitchen table. It would settle, as though something had been returned to its correct position. She had kept the cottage. This was her one condition, spoken on the evening of his proposal with the directness he had come to expect from her. She would not sell it, and she would not let it fall empty. She went there on mornings when she wanted to think, or to read, or to be alone in the particular way that only a woman who had lived alone for 2 years understood. Piers did not object. He understood in the way that he now understood most things about her, that the cottage was not a retreat from him, but a part of her that existed before he arrived and would continue to exist, because she was not a woman who abandoned the parts of herself that no longer served convenience. The writing desk still held Josiah's letter. She did not hide it. She did not display it. It was simply there, in its drawer, and Piers knew of it, and the knowing was not a wound, but a fact. And facts were things they both preferred to feelings that required management. On a Sunday morning in the 5th year, their son, Josiah Arthur Colquhoun, named for a naval lieutenant who had once described wound care in a letter and a duke's father who had never lived to see his grandson, climbed onto his father's lap in the breakfast room and touched the scar on Piers's arm with one small finger. The boy was 4, dark-haired like his father, with his mother's steady gaze and her habit of examining things closely before speaking about them. "What is that?" the boy asked. Piers looked at Nora across the table. She was buttering toast. She did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved, that faint trace of a smile, the one that altered everything. "That," Piers said, "is where your mother saved my life." "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Did she cry?" Piers looked at Nora again. She met his eyes this time, directly, steadily, the same gaze she had fixed on the wound, and on him, and on every true thing she had ever faced without flinching. "No," Piers said. "She did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not speak except to tell me what to do. And I have never, in all my life, seen anything braver." Nora returned to her toast. The butter knife was steady in her hand. The morning light came through the breakfast room windows in long columns of pale gold, and outside, the gardens of Aldermere stretched toward the east cottage where a tablecloth had once been ruined and a duke had once lain bleeding on a kitchen table watching a woman's face rather than her hands, and had seen there the thing he had spent his whole life looking for without knowing its name. Not courage. Something quieter. The absolute absence of the need to be seen being brave. They arrive here, like a needle drawing thread through a wound, unhurried, precise, making whole what was torn without any fuss at all.